G'day YouTube, Warbles on a lot here. I'm going to record a background briefing program. It's a documentary into sex abuse in the home, and it looks at what society's trying to achieve with the legal system when it catches pedophiles. Is society trying to set things up so that the perpetrator does not re-offend, or is society trying to set things up so that some people feel like they've been made to suffer for their actions? So strap yourself in. It's not an easy program to listen to, and I've got to confess that I still don't really know where I stand on the issue. Back soon.
And child protection advocates say they're being flooded with calls for help. Research shows that up to 80% of all child sexual abuse occurs within the family, not an institution like a church or a school. But the vast majority of these cases will not be examined by the Royal Commission because it excludes abuse within families. Sarah Dingle investigates the fallout of that decision. And finally, a warning: some listeners may find this program distressing. This year began as a year for Australia to finally right past wrongs.
I believe in these circumstances that it's appropriate for there to be a national response through a Royal Commission. This, I hope, will help with healing, but I specifically hope that its recommendations will help us ensure that this never ever happens again.
In January, the terms of reference were announced for the National Royal Commission into institutional child sexual abuse. The Royal Commission will delve into clubs, community and religious organisations to expose shocking injustices perpetrated against young victims. But the majority of child sexual abuse victims are locked out of this process. The head of the Social Justice Research Centre, Professor Caroline Taylor, says their hopes have already been dashed.
I've had enormous numbers of survivors speaking to me, and they're very distressed. They feel very angry, and once again, that they've been made completely invisible.
None of these public inquiries will examine the most abusive institution of all, the family. The family is responsible for the vast bulk of child sexual abuse, according to psychologist and criminologist Professor Stephen Smallbone.
I think in around 70 to 80% of cases, the relationship between the offender and the victim is a familial relationship of some kind.
Child sexual abuse is more common than many realise. 1 in 6 Australian boys and 1 in 3 girls will be sexually abused before the age of 18. This week, Background Briefing hears from the victims of inter-familial child sexual abuse.
When I was around 11 or 12, I started to ask Dad, why are you doing this? And he'd just say, it's okay, just forget it.
I remember straight after he did it, I ran to the toilet and I started crying my eyes out, thinking, wow, he's just raped me. I can't believe this has really just happened.
We also hear from an abuser.
It started out of my continual use of pornography through the internet, and eventually I got curious, and one day I decided to experiment with my daughter.
We speak to non-offending parents who also suffer ongoing guilt and trauma.
I was obviously shocked, revolted, just heartbroken, guilty for not picking up on other things that I felt I should have been able to pick up on.
This week, Background Briefing turns the spotlight onto the heart of child sexual abuse, the darkest corners of the family. I'm Sarah Dingle. It's a fine Friday morning in Sydney's west, and I'm at a park bench by a river. Joggers and families are out enjoying the winter sun. I've come here to meet John. John is a 41-year-old convicted sex offender. When was the first incident with your daughter?
She was between 2 and 3 years old. You know, we were at home by ourselves, and we were just sitting on the couch, and I thought I would try some things. During that first instance, I got a huge thrill from it, and subsequent abuses It was from recalling the previous thrills I got and a selfish desire to want to get those thrills again. So it was really about me satisfying my own selfishness.
John put considerable effort into not getting caught.
All I thought was, to ensure that I didn't harm her physically, because that could leave evidence of some sort. And I also believed or told myself that, as she was such a young age, she wouldn't remember. And if she didn't remember, it wouldn't hurt her in any way.
So how long did the abuse go on for?
It was on and off until eventually she disclosed to her school teacher when she was, I believe, 12 years old.
And what were you thinking throughout that time?
I was thinking about the consequences to myself. I wasn't thinking about the harm I'd actually caused, to my wife and daughter.
Was your daughter the first child you'd ever abused?
Yes.
And is she the only child you've ever abused?
Yes.
John has been convicted on 8 counts, including 3 of sexual intercourse with a person under 10. In many ways, John is typical of an inter-familial child abuser. The perpetrators are overwhelmingly males, mostly adults in some sort of authority role, a father, a boyfriend, or a grandfather.
I think being the authority figure, it gave me the impression that I was more easily able to control her.
Queensland-based criminologist Professor Stephen Smallbone.
Sex offending, like other offending, is really about rule breaking. It's about exploitation of other people. It's not only a matter of that more sexual abuse occurs in homes than it does in organisations, but it's also true that kids who are abused in homes tend to be more harmed than kids who are abused in other settings. The outcomes for victims are generally worse when the abuser is a father or a father figure.
None of this will be covered by the Royal Commission into Institutional Child Sexual Abuse. A spokesperson for the Attorney-General says the Royal Commission has to be specific enough to ensure concrete recommendations in a reasonable time frame. In other words, the Royal Commission would be overwhelmed if it took on interfamilial cases. And even if it's claimed that other institutions helped facilitate interfamilial child sexual abuse, those cases won't be heard either. That's the experience of one South Australian mother who we'll call Jennifer. 5 years ago, Jennifer says her husband had been asked to leave the home by police as he was becoming increasingly threatening.
I had security cameras set up in my home because I was at the time concerned for my safety and my children's safety.
Instead of capturing a break-in, Jennifer says the cameras caught something else. The odd behaviour of her sons, then aged 3 and 4.
They were trying to do anal and oral sex, and they were trying to put penises in mouths and bottoms and saying that's what their father had done to them.
Panicked, Jennifer contacted the police, Families SA and Child Protection Services. Jennifer says the police told her to go to the family court, but the judge didn't share her concerns.
After looking at the security footage of the children engaging in the adult sexual behaviour, decided that was normal for 3 and 4 year olds to engage in that sort of sexual behaviour, and so gave the children to the father, the alleged perpetrator, and took them from my care, then labelled me as delusional for believing that it wasn't normal behaviour. So I lost my children.
Jennifer claims the abuse continued after the father was granted custody. Repeated notifications of sexual abuse to Families SA failed to produce any change in the parenting arrangement. The then South Australian Minister for Families, Jennifer Rankin, ordered an independent review of the actions taken by Families SA. Background Briefing has seen a copy of that report delivered in 2011. It says, from the case files of Families SA, it's not possible to say that the children are the victims of interfamilial child sexual abuse. They also say the CCTV footage was not comprehensively investigated, and that Families SA should have arranged a detailed psychological family assessment. To date, no such assessment has been carried out. and the children still live with their father. One person who has viewed the footage is child abuse expert Professor Frida Briggs, a former Senior Australian of the Year who has acted as a child protection consultant to UNICEF and the World Health Organization.
My expertise is in child development, and I mean, quite honestly, nobody would be a kindergarten teacher if this was normal behaviour, because it was absolutely obsessive.
Professor Briggs gave evidence in court, but to no avail. She says there's research to suggest that the odds are stacked against mothers like Jennifer, who make claims of child sexual abuse.
Your decent, average male cannot understand how anybody, least of all a father, could see his child as a sex object and use that child for sex. There's been several studies, and it was found, for example, that men could not believe that this happened unless they themselves had been abused. And of course this has significance for men who are on juries in child sex abuse trials. We're finding that police and social workers don't want to believe, and family courts don't want to believe, that fathers are sexually abusing the children.
Jennifer's last hope was the Royal Commission. Initially, she says she was asked to give evidence.
They contacted me recently and said that unfortunately they'd checked with their legal team and that this case of my children fell outside of their terms of reference. They weren't looking at cases where the abuse had occurred by a family member, and that they were only looking at cases including churches and sporting clubs, and they weren't looking at cases like the family court or cases including, you know, Families SA or the police. So it's a big disappointment. I don't know really what to do now.
When it comes to young children, none of the systems are protecting young children from incest, and that is a huge problem.
In Western Australia, another child protection expert says that since the Royal Commission was called, she's been contacted by distraught victims of inter-familial child sexual abuse. Professor Caroline Taylor from Edith Cowan University in Perth.
I've had victim survivors say to me, obviously it doesn't mean much that I was abused in the family because the Royal Commission doesn't want to hear about this. And what we fail to understand also is that victims abused in a family setting, research backs this up, are more likely to be abused for far longer periods of time because the offender has access 24/7.
Professor Taylor says continual access can also lead to intergenerational abuse, as in the case of one family where a child reported sexual abuse by their grandfather.
The mother, who was the daughter of the alleged offender, contacted police, very, very distressed, but the mother then disclosed that she had actually been sexually abused by her father. When police began to investigate and talk to other family members, they then found that 4 other sisters had been sexually abused by the father. Then when they spoke to the children, a number of their children had been sexually abused, and also a number of nieces and nephews. So suddenly we had around 23 victims in the one family by an offender who had been a predator. And this is not the only time that I've ever been aware of cases like this.
As well as creating the conditions for abuse, the family can be one of the most secretive institutions of all. Sue kept the abuse secret for years, only to discover she wasn't alone.
I was probably about 7 years old when my stepfather started abusing me, and it was kind of off and on till about aged 11. He'd say to me, "Don't ever tell your mother because, you know, she'll get cranky with you and you'll be in big trouble." And so I kind of kept it to myself.
You said you weren't the only one. Who else did he target?
So my sister and her daughter, and also my youngest brother.
Sue's stepfather went to his grave without facing charges.
I know I did find a huge relief in his death. I thought that was good. Yeah. For me, I had the satisfaction of not going to the funeral. I chose to do that because I had control of that. I like that.
For Sue, the psychological effects of the abuse continued for decades. She's now 53.
I think I told my husband, the first person I ever told was probably about 5 years ago, maybe.
What did your husband say when you first told him?
He said he knew. Yeah. So... it's good. Good to have someone like that in your life. So...
Sue has been through a non-profit organisation's therapy and support program. Heartfelt House aims to help adult victims of child sexual abuse. The executive director and founder of Heartfelt House is Vicky de Bruns.
Most of the women that come through our program are aged between 30 and 60. We've had a lady in her late 70s who've come through, and a majority of them are disclosing for the very first time. And the perpetrator ensures that there's a lot of threats in place. We've heard them all over the years too. If you tell anybody, I'll just move on to your sisters, to I'll kill your puppy dog, or your mother will go to jail for not knowing, you know, all these terrible threats. And so that's why disclosure doesn't take place. It's not amazing to us that the disclosure doesn't take place. It's amazing to us that the disclosure ever does take place.
Heartfelt House provides 18-week counselling courses for survivors. Although the courses are open to all adult survivors of child sexual abuse, the vast majority are inter-familial victims.
Familial abuse makes up a majority of the survivors that come through our doors here. We actually get very few that have been abused within an institution, and as I said, once again, that correlates with the statistics that are out there.
The announcement of the Royal Commission has sent a clarion call to all survivors of child sexual abuse. It's also meant a big jump in calls for help to organisations like Heartfelt House.
Inquiries here have gone up, from agencies have gone up 150%, and from survivors themselves have gone up 200%, so it's doubled. Our challenge now is to meet that need.
The Royal Commission has brought with it a pot of $45 million to help the victims of institutional child sexual abuse. Heartfelt House applied for but hasn't received any of that funding. A number of other victim support agencies have received funding through the Royal Commission, and you can find a link to a list of those organisations on our website. Vicky de Bruns says more broadly there needs to be an ongoing source of funding which organisations like hers can apply for.
Here endeth part 1 of background briefing into inter-familial sexual abuse.